welcome to the Mill. So excited to have a very special guest, one of my longest friends from college through our professional lives, and now working together as Mill & Co. and client, Siobhán Callanan. Siobhán, thank you so much for being here with us today.
So excited, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Quick background on Siobhán, whose pronouns are she, her, hers. She's worked for more than a decade in the aviation industry and is currently the general manager at Walbar Peabody, a part of Collins Aerospace, where she leads a cross-functional organization to repair and process core hot section components of commercial jet engines. So, easy work. As the accountable manager, Siobhán is responsible for the engineering, operations, safety, quality, commercial, and business development, with a different functional leader on her team leading each group. Siobhán holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Johns Hopkins University. Ever heard of it? Where she also played college basketball, holds a master's degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from Purdue, and a master's in business administration from Indiana University's Kelley School of Business. A real underachiever. Siobhán, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it.
Isn't it so fun having your bio read back to you? You're like,
I know,
yeah,
it's a little like, you kind of like touch a little bit. You're like, oh yeah, that's right.
Oh,
thanks.
You did all that. That's very cool. So I want to start with some personal questions. It's so interesting to me, the work that you do, having known you for a very long time. When I think engineering, and I know this is such a stereotype, you just don't pop up for me. You're so lively and bubbly and personable. And my gosh, I can already see the hate comments rolling in here. Love all of my engineer friends. But I'd love to know about your journey. And if you could share maybe a moment or an experience that helped shape your decision to get into a leadership role, let alone in the aviation industry, and what ultimately led you to being the GM at Walbar Peabody.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. It's funny because to your point, like even in college, I remember people asking like, what's your major? And people are expecting lots of different answers, right? And mechanical and aerospace engineering. Really? Oh, okay, casual. So yeah, I mean, for me, I think, all through high school, math and science were just really things that I loved and enjoyed. My dad's an engineer, my mom's an actuary. So one could argue we're cursed from the beginning. I have two sisters, so of the three girls, we have two engineers and an actuary. So we didn't veer very far.
That's right.
Yeah. So, I would say that because my dad was an engineer, I knew a lot more about engineering, right? I kind of went into undergrad knowing that I wanted to do engineering. Really enjoyed it when I was at Hopkins. I think engineering for me was problem solving. So when I graduated, I started working for kind of an engine designer on the aircraft side, was very in the weeds in the technical design analysis, loved the problem solving component of that. And I actually had an HR leader kind of ask me, well, like as your career goes, in leadership. And I was like, whoa, like I'm an engineer, lady. Right. And kind of it was her that was like, yeah, I get that you're an engineer now, but based on kind of some of the things that you just mentioned, non-traditional, where you're actively engaging, you're reaching out, you're reaching across organizations. I was very inquisitive, right, from an engineering standpoint, obviously, but I think I used that same approach in how I showed up at work relative to interacting with people, which to your point may be less traditional for an engineer. And I think really leaning on kind of leading across functions, right? Going outside my silo, going down and walking the floor, talking to people, talking to the manufacturing team, talking to the sourcing team, and kind of building more of that collaboration, I think is really what drove into more of the leadership side for me, right? Because I would argue I did engineering for about 5 years. So, from a technical depth standpoint, I certainly understand the engine and the engine components and all of that. But relative to like true depth, I think I had a lot more breadth, just because I was able to create some of those networks and ask questions and have people that I was able to ask, as I said, ask questions, and learn, get on projects, kind of understand, see different sides of the business. And I think that's what then really ultimately for me led into more of a leadership type role. When I was with GE. So I spent a decade with GE Aviation, now Aerospace. Really, really loved that experience. Built, candidly, a network of friends that became almost family, right? Sponsors, mentors, coaches. It was really some of those individuals that from that networking side enabled me to get some roles and opportunities that challenged me. That I think, on my own, I may not have said, hey, I want to go do that job, but they were the first in the room that said, I think Siobhan could do that job. Why don't we see what happens and kind of go from there? And that's really how I got more into the leadership type roles, leading different teams, transitioning into the operations side. I joke, left engineering, went to the dark side, supply chain, and more of the operations side, which has been more of that leadership piece, to your point.
Two things pop out to me about your story, and I think it's applicable to anyone in any industry, in any level of your business. Number one is that you had a mentor or someone that reached to you and said, you can do this, and gave you permission to think about yourself as more than just the engineer, which was incredible to be an engineer, but to say to you, hey, Siobhan, you could do this. You can do this. I see this for you. I think that's incredibly important. I think particularly as women, regardless of the industry that you're in, we need to be reaching out to everyone around us, whether they are quote unquote beneath us, they're more junior, or even if they're above us. Offering that hand, that perspective is life-changing for people. Look where you are now. And certainly I think you would have gotten there on your own, but I bet that really helped. And it was important enough that you just brought it up right now. So that's number one. Number two is that you have recognized your skill set, that while you are incredibly technical, logistical, rational, you're also strategic and creative, and you're a problem solver. You're a people person. So by recognizing within yourself, what am I good at, helps then determine, well, what can I use this for? Does this make for me to be a good leader? Am I a really good support person? What's my role? How am I going to get myself there?
Yeah, no, Rachel, I completely agree with that. I had a project that was about 8 months long, and I was very much intertwined with the operations. It was very fast paced. I kind of stepped out of engineering. And towards the end of that, there was a point of, what role do I want to do next? And at that time, I was on part of GE's kind of accelerated training leadership program, right? And I was there through the engineering function. And, I had, again, people, I would say, in my corner, VP of engineering, VP of supply chain, and we fundamentally had a conversation, do you want to go back to engineering? And candidly, I think for me, I really wanted to say yes, because I felt like that's what I was supposed to say. I had been identified through this engineering function. I was on the engineering leadership program, right? And I think a big thing for me too was the VP of engineering, Gary Mercer, amazing leader. He said to me, whatever is your decision, I'll support it, which I think was also huge. Sometimes you need to hear somebody say that, right? And, I was like, I loved the operations. I loved the pace of it. What I loved about engineering was the problem solving, but it was more at a micro level. And kind of, you mentioned the strategic piece, and that's what I enjoyed. In this other role, I was looking more bigger picture. I was taking some of the micro problems that are super complex and technical that the engineering team was working on, right? And putting them into the broader picture. What does that look like for the fleet? What does that look like for our customers? What does it mean? And I'm an avid question asker. So I think it really enabled me to ask some of those bigger questions. And that's the part that I enjoy. I'm getting excited even talking about it right now, right? And seeing those bigger pictures and challenging and asking, really the what does that mean type of questions to understand where we can go is really what draws me to the industry, particularly the aftermarket side of the industry, because it is so complex.
Yeah.
That connection with the customer is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And given your past experience as captain of the women's basketball team at Johns Hopkins, how has that influenced your ability now to guide a team, especially when it comes to things like fostering teamwork? You've got a lot of different personalities that you're dealing with, making sure everyone's aligned and on the same page, working towards the same vision, motivation, and effective communication, knowing that there are differing personalities and agendas and timelines.
Yeah, I would say not even just the captaincy piece, but like playing sports in college is a very humbling experience, I'll say, as you know,
Sure
right?
do.
Anybody that makes the decision at any level, D1, D2, D3, right, to go play athletics at the collegiate level, they were clearly a good high school player, right? Like you don't
Yeah.
go play college sports if you were just an average high school player. Like you were probably all state, all region, like pick the term, right? But then you get to go to college and you join a team where everybody was not, right? So I think I would say not even the captaincy piece, but just like the athletics portion in itself was very humbling for me. I came in and I was not a freshman starter, sophomore starter, junior starter, right? I really had to work through my 4 years to earn that starting spot my senior year, and my captaincy. And I would say when I, now at 34, I look back in it too, I could challenge your question to say, I look at it, I'm like, well, there's a whole lot of things I didn't do right as a captain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Being 22, 21, 22, and kind of thinking, what's what. But I would say what I really learned during that senior year as my captaincy is I actually tore my ACL. So I had kind of worked for 3 years. My junior year, I played most of the games, right? The senior year, kind of worked my way into the starting lineup. Was really dependent upon as a person on the floor, and as a person who very much likes to contribute. Like halfway through the season, blew out my knee. So now I have to really figure out, as the more energetic of the two captains, right? My best friend and I were kind of the yin and the yang. Lindsay, and between the two of us, I'm kind of the louder, more outgoing person, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Lindsay was a phenomenal athlete, all-American, right? Very much more of like the quiet leader on the floor, exemplified, like she demonstrated what we needed to do. But then, now I'm in a position, I tore my knee, I can't play. So I would say there was a point at which you kind of have a decision, okay, so what type of a leader does that make me now, right? I'm not on the floor leading. I'm literally have to lead from the bench. And I still remember I tore my knee the first half, and at halftime of every game, I brought the team together. That was just kind of what we did. We did our little, before the game, before we get back in the second half, all right, bring it in, let's go. And I was on the floor, my knee was raised. Alex Asilla's mom was sitting with me. And I was like, all right, bring it in. And my team was like on the floor, like looking at me, like, is she crazy? Well, yes, obviously.
Yeah.
But it was like, like bring it in. This doesn't change because I'm sitting here, right? So let's bring it in. Let's go get the second half going. And I think for me, I reflect on that moment partly because I had a choice, if that makes sense, right? Like I could have sat and felt sorry for myself, sulked, and kind of like, well, that's my season gone, but that wouldn't have done anybody any good.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think I really realized the importance of that decision until I look back and really think about it. To me, it was obvious in the moment, right? But I think that says a lot of like my approach and how the challenges I have to kind of really reframe what type of leader do I want to be, right? I think when I look at it in the work world now, I'm not going to be the functional expert in all of the areas, right? I have an engineering background, but that doesn't mean I understand the full details of the material science and the metallurgy, right, of some of the work that we do. So I have to create and kind of lead again from the bench with that team, kind of ask the right questions, challenge them, push them, hold them accountable, right? But create a level of trust because I can't be the one doing the thing that they have to go do.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
It's just such a powerful analogy. And I think back to my own professional experience. I was very lucky as an athlete to never have a serious injury. Knock on wood. I no longer play competitive sports. I'm taking bar classes now. But I think back on my professional career and starting a business and growing that business as a young woman. There have been a lot of figurative ACL tears in my career, right? And you're absolutely right, Siobhan. There are leaders that lead by example. And then there are those who don't need to do the work to still motivate others to get the results that they need. And so I think what's important here of your story and your lesson for others listening and watching is that things are going to happen. But as long as you are aware of your values, what you truly care about as an individual, that will come through regardless of the situation that you're in. You just have to stick true to those values. For me, values are kindness, empathy, and open communication. Mm-hmm. So no matter what happens, as long as I'm doing those three things, I will be satisfied with the work that I'm delivering.
No, I completely agree with you, Rachel. And I think about it when I work in more of a corporate type structure, right? So fundamentally, some things are just out of my control, mm-hmm. right? Decisions are going to be made that I might not agree with, I might disagree with, but it doesn't change the fact that it's decision. Right. I'm stubborn. I will certainly voice my opinion, right? I got no problem doing that and challenging the status quo up. And there's also a piece of some things are just uncontrollable. Even think about obviously all this COVID world that we've gone through, right? Like things aren't in our control. Tearing my ACL, like, was it in my control? So now let's figure out what is in my control and what can we do about it, right? And I think that's the same thing in like any organization, any structure, right? Understanding what you can and can't change is huge. And it's really easy to just focus on the uncontrollable type items, right? Play the victim, like kind of feel sorry for yourself in that piece, but that doesn't move the needle. And I think being able to understand the difference in that is huge, right? Again, feel the feeling, right? And then now figure out what you can do about what you can do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you're just shifting gears slightly, you're in a prominent leadership role in a predominantly male dominated industry. Mm-hmm. Call it what it is, right?
Yeah.
Do you have an example? You may not, but do you have an example of an early career challenge that tested your resilience and determination in a very heavily male dominated industry?
I mean, I think like you're right, male dominated, like the data kind of speaks for itself. I think like less than 10% of aerospace engineers are female, like in just from a pure like industry standpoint, right? But with that, I think the experiences that I've had, obviously being female is one piece of it. The reality is in an engineering organization, candidly, there's a huge ageism component that those two pieces also tied together, right? It's not just that you're female, it's also that you're young, right? Because there's an assumption of experience and hierarchy and all that good stuff. So I think for me, honestly, like there's a lot of days that you could argue were examples, but it's language, I think that's important. Like I remember being 23, 24, right? And you're at a meeting and, somebody's calling you girl, hun, sweetie, right? And I would say 24-year-old Siobhan probably didn't always react in the most effective
We've grown.
Right? We've grown a little bit. However, at the same time, if you're in a very quote unquote old culture, right? Old school type culture, there's also a reality that people react to things in different ways. So kind of being comfortable saying, hey, I'm not your hun, I'm not your sweetie. My name's Siobhan. If you don't know how to say my name, please ask me, right? I have no problem clarifying how to say my name, right? But I'm not your hun and I'm not your sweetie.
Yeah.
Right?
What would you say to yourself looking back right out of getting your degrees and heading into GE, walking through those doors? What's some advice that you would give your younger self?
Probably don't take myself too seriously. I think it's really easy to, in that situation, make everything a nail, right? Like if you're only a hammer, there's that saying that I'll probably butcher. And I would argue, like for a lot of my career, everything I'm a really, really good hammer, let me tell you, right? But that doesn't always generate long-term results, right? In my current role, like I have regulatory agencies come through, right? So like certifying bodies within aviation that are traditionally a bit more old school, right? I have auditors come in that again might be old school, right? I had somebody come in and I introduced myself as a general manager and he looked at me and looked me up and down and said, well, good for you. Right? Like, that's an experience I had this year. And again, if the like hammer approach would be really easy to be like, listen, but that's not going to help my team, first of all, get what they need to get out of me as a leader. Right? So my response was more, you're right, it is good for me. I've worked really hard to get where I am. Thank you for recognizing that.
Yep. I recently, like within the last 3 months, I've shared this on a previous podcast and I won't give any details. I was recently asked on a prospective client call from a client that reached out to me that was interested in our strategic services, asked me, I noticed on your LinkedIn that you don't have an MBA, and I'm curious how you feel then qualified to run our marketing strategy. On a Zoom call to my face. Okay. This was a significantly older gentleman. And my response was to run through the incredible work that my business has done for the last 5.5 years, the clients that we've served, and how proud I am to have built this.
Exactly.
And then reminded him that I am certainly not hurting for business. So at the end of that call, I ended up emailing and withdrew our name from consideration. And in a way, it was a very professional note, but it did make me feel empowered. And it's very hard to do. 5 years ago, when I'm only 6 months into business, I probably would have put up with that.
Yeah.
And I have no shame saying that, because I used to shame myself for being like, oh, I'm just looking for, I gotta put food on the table for myself in this Manhattan apartment that I'm living in that's so expensive, but I think over time, as you have more experience, you gain more confidence, you find the right ways to have conversations like you did with that individual, and stand up for yourself in a way that feels truly validating, without being disrespectful. As much as I wanted to rip this person a new one and say, how dare you say that to me? And then I felt great, and I walked away from it and felt very proud of myself that I'm protecting the integrity of the work I've done, the company that I have, and the people that work with me every day.
I think that comes back to your earlier comment, right? On understanding what your core values are. And like in the work that you do every day, are you staying true to yourself? Right. I know that when I'm not staying true to myself, if I'm working in an organization or within a team, I am exhausted. Right. Like it's a different type of exhaustion where at the end of the day, I literally have no energy because it's sucking it from me. Right. And I think that's the thing also then as leaders, right? It's what the organization are we creating and are we pouring into our teams, right? Like, are we filling up their cups? And is our cup getting filled up, right? Like in the organization we're working with, like, do we have that connection and are we getting our cups filled up such that we're able to create that environment for other people? I've recently had, to your like an auditor, regulatory, they come regularly, right? It's the nature of the aviation world. And I have some younger female engineers on my team. And I came into the meeting, I was dressed in a blazer, right? I sat at the head of the table. I was originally sat in a chair that was lower and I was sitting low and like, this is, so I moved the chair, right? I put a taller chair in, I sat at the head of the table and she saw her like looking at me. And I was like, it'll make sense. Right. And we're in the session and one of the older gentlemen looks at me and he's like, I'm sorry, what do you do here again? Right. And I'm like, I'm Siobhán Callanan. I'm the general manager. I have the privilege of leading the facility, and you saw her and she talked to me afterwards and she's like, it made sense. And again, I think it would be great to live in a world where like, we don't have to do those things, but I think that's this idealistic assumption. That's not reality. Right. So I think part of the burden might be the wrong term, right? But I think part of the reality of is understanding where we are, operating within it so that we can continue to grow and advance and have the ability to change it, right? Like I don't want that engineer in 12 years to have to do that. But if I make a big fuss out of it, to your point, I'm just blowing up the spot and it's not going to be effective, right? I'm not going to get my next opportunity and I'm not going to be able to grow. I'm not going to be able to create the change that I want to see. And again, if you want to just have a really short-sighted view of it, I might have won that conversation, right? But I'm winning the battle, losing the war.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's a lot of battles that need to be continuously fought. And so while it may seem like a very uphill climb, it does not mean that we shouldn't stand up for ourselves in those moments. And for me, it really boils down to, are you aware and aligned with what your internal values are? Step one. Once you're there, then it is an active and ongoing practice of asserting those values on anyone and everyone who will listen to you, and even those who don't, because you're not going to change other people's behavior, but you at the end of the day want to be very proud of how you represent yourself and your organization.
Absolutely.
So speaking of being badass bitches, I can say that 'cause it's my podcast. We won't blurb that out. Bleep. There we go.
Whatever,
Bleep that part out. So leadership is a delicate balance of a lot of things. Two things that come to me are having a sort of a confident assertiveness while also having an empathetic, collaborative approach. It could be two somewhat opposing things sometimes, but together they create, in my opinion, a very strong leader. So I'd love for you to talk about this balance. If you've experienced these two things, how you've been able to strike it, you know, and thinking through all the people that you've worked with, the personalities that kind of layer into that. Talk me through your leadership style.
Yeah. To your point, I think, you know, I've taken a number of different roles over the last like 6 years, like really in like more of a people leader, organizational leader type roles. And mentioned, I think I was historically a lot more hammer. And what I mean by that is that doesn't mean I have less accountability in the organization now, for clarification, right? But I think the approach is what's important, right? Like I came into this role and, you know, my first focus is understanding the people, right? Who they are, build connections. You know, I have one-on-ones with my direct team every other week. Half the time we're not talking about work, right? It's connecting with what's going on with them. It's creating the relationship, right? And really building an organization that's centered around trust, right? So then, in my opinion, like accountability and trust go hand in hand, right? If I'm not creating boundaries and asking questions to hold them accountable, it's really hard for them to also trust me, right? Because like, where are their bounds? What are they responsible for? What are they not responsible for? So I think the trust piece is so huge, right? Creating the culture where people are comfortable asking questions, bringing things to you, right? If every time somebody brought me a problem, I freaked out, like nobody would want to bring me problems.
Right.
Right. So, you know, if we have an audit that doesn't go well or something happens and somebody comes to me and they're like, hey, I want to make you aware of this, right? First of all, thanks for making me aware of it. You could have easily not, right? And I could have found out about it later down the line and gotten bit. So I appreciate you coming to talk to me about it. Now let's go see what we can do about it, right?
Yeah.
And I think a huge part of that is also feeling comfortable letting my team do their jobs, right? So I've ran operations. I have an operations leader, right? It would be really easy for me to be in the weeds of his job every single day. That wouldn't be fun for him, and that would not be fun for me, right? Because that's one facet of what my job is. Could I do it? Sure. Again, would other things suffer? Yes. So part of it is understanding that he knows when he comes to our daily meeting every day, I'm going to have questions for him, right? I've run the numbers. I see what they are. Like I see what's on track, what's behind. So I'm going to have questions for him, but I'm also going to trust that he hears my questions. He knows what to do, kind of have that follow-up and escalation. And if he has an issue, again, he is going to come to me, right? Yeah. And I think that trust and that culture piece is fundamentally the foundation, right? I think a lot of companies or organizations, you know, think about, you know, we got to get the goals, the job done, and then people will be happier. When I think the reality is if we create the organization where people feel comfortable, right, where they're bringing them whole selves, like, right, they're showing up, they're asking questions, and the goals fundamentally get easier because we're working together a bit more collaboratively.
Yeah, there's a
doesn't
line.
mean perfect it every day for clarification, right? There's days where you go on one side of it and the other, but you know, fundamentally that's the goal.
Yeah. Love that. And I think there's layers to that as a female leader, where being assertive and confident can be perceived negatively. And I'd love for you to comment on that stereotype.
I think it's similar to what we talked about earlier. Like, the reality is it's there, right? We can't ignore it. I think for me, it's understanding that, frankly, if you think of like traditional masculine and feminine descriptors, right? When like I read a lot of books around diversity, right? Equity, inclusion, just like what their approaches are. And there's typically talking about men and women. And the descriptors that they have, right, for men are typically more of the descriptors that actually apply to me when it comes to, I'm very comfortable interacting, I'm direct. Arguably, to your point, does that direct lean on confrontational at times, right? I'm comfortable with the engagement. But I also need to be aware of, just because I'm comfortable with it doesn't mean the person I'm talking to is comfortable with it. So I think for me, as I've grown in my leadership journey, right, it's understanding that I personally need to pause, right? I know myself well enough to know that if I don't have the right pauses right before a meeting or in my day, just in general, my natural tendency is just going to be run through the day. Right. I can just keep on going, show up to every meeting, tell them what I think, check that, cross that off, move to the next one. Right. Like I'm capable of doing that. So I need to create the pause and the structure in my day to say, okay, what is the purpose of this meeting? Right. What's the goal? What is the outcome we're trying to achieve in this next session? If the goal is for the team to come up with the best solution, right, me coming in and starting to talk is not going to help us get there, because I'm going to make a suggestion. I'm the senior leader in the room. People are going to say, that's a great idea. We're going to talk for 20 minutes about how great my idea was, and then we're going to go, right?
Yeah.
Versus coming in and saying, okay, who's leading the session? What's the goal? Sounds good. Go around the room, always speak last, right? Just like little things that, again, I know my natural tendency is to come in and talk. So I also,
what?
Right.
I'm shocked.
I know, right? So, but at the same time, when it comes to times you have to have conversations, right? Like I run a manufacturing facility. Safety and quality are like paramount, right? They're the expectation when you walk in the door, right? So somebody's not wearing safety glasses, they're not wearing their steel toes, right? Like we're going to have a conversation. We also have a process, right? Every organization has a discipline process, right? That's fundamentally there. And that comes back to the accountability and trust, right? People need to understand where their bounds are. So like I've had conversations with people and it's their first like verbal coaching, right? And I would argue like I've leaned in at times to some of the stereotypes. Like right now you're getting my mom voice, right? This conversation is you're getting my direct approach, right? You're getting my mom voice because you're not doing what you need to do and you know it. Next time we have this conversation, we're going to start talking about paperwork and write-ups, right? So there's been some, there's some humor around that, right? The joke is mama bear and like, that's just who I am, right? I protect the team. And there is some humor to it, right? Again, comes back to, I could take that really personally and get offended by it, but like, there's no malice behind it, right? And I think understanding that creating an environment where the team feels comfortable to collaborate, right? And that if I wanted to come in and just be a hammer every day, that wouldn't enable the team to be innovative and collaborative.
Yeah, totally agree with you.
So.
And what's interesting about your team having been on the site, I think there's 75 employees on site, and I think I counted 7 or 8 women between the engineering team and some of the operators. And so, while steering clear of stereotypes, the act of recognizing and addressing gender dynamics can be very empowering for people. So I'd love to know, how have you been attempting and working to incorporate conversations around gender diversity into your leadership conversations, making sure that it complements really the primary focus of the site, the job, making sure everyone still feels included?
I mean, I think So for me, you know, I've been very open with my team. They know it's something I'm passionate about, right? So I think there's also different levels of the organization, right? So like my direct team, we have a lot more conversations about it, right? We do book clubs, TED Talks. You get them in a room and ask them how passionate I am about this, and they'll all give you a good eye roll, right? Because they know it's a topic, right? Amongst my peer group and my leadership, like outside of my site, you know, I'm the person who pushes out the Friday, here's some things I found this week, right? Type of conversations that we need to lean into. That being said, leading an organization, to your point that we have 7 or 8 women, we also have more diversity than just that, right? It's not just understanding, you know, gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, but there's all different facets of the diversity piece and understanding the diversity of perspective and experience. So we have a monthly town hall, right? And every month we talk about something. In August, we talked about ageism, right? I mentioned ageism earlier. August 21st is both International Youth Day and Senior Citizens Day. So we kind of went off of that from an irony standpoint, right? And had a conversation about ageism and how does it affect you, right? How does it affect such that, as I mentioned, like as a young female engineer in a meeting versus an older male engineer in the meeting, like who gets listened to and why, right? So I think gender is obviously one piece of that. I think my approach with my direct team, right, is fundamentally like factual information, right? A lot of times, I think there can be misconceptions around ignorance versus malice, right? And I think there's one thing to be ignorant, right? And like unconscious bias and understanding like what your natural tendencies are versus having a malicious intent. So I think for my team, where there are, frankly, like my direct team is predominantly all men, being comfortable having the conversation, step one, right? Also seeking their experience as a part of the conversation, right? Like, what have they experienced that I might not be aware of either, right? And then within the broader platform from a town hall standpoint, my approach is always to make it personable, excuse me. Right? Where again, if I get up and just like spit all these facts at people and tell them like diversity is good and this is all, like people aren't going to listen to me, right? So like ageism, talked about my experience being a young engineer, talked about other people's experience being older, right? And sometimes you make some lighthearted stories about it to again make it a bit more personal. In July, we talked about ableism and disability. July was Disability Awareness Month, right? My aunt is in a wheelchair, and we talked about the stories that she has, and she's just like outside holding a cup of tea, and people put money in her cup, and because she's just like sitting there drinking tea, and they're making an assumption that she's asking for money, right?
How much did she get?
Like exactly, right? And like again, it's not malice. Like the person who put money in her cup isn't like assuming, right? Like he's making it, or he or she is making an assumption, right? Again, it's not like they're a bad person. They're clearly like trying to, like they're giving money, right? But it's an ignorance, right? They're making an assumption, their unconscious bias jumped in. So like having some of those conversations then facilitates other conversations, right? So from that conversation in July, I know that one of my inspectors, right, his nephew died. He was in a wheelchair until he was 34. And like, we have other conversations about his experience. And like, it, in my opinion, like that's when it then leads to the dialogue, right? And that's really the goal in our town halls is we have a different topic, and part of it's education, right? Like we talked about Juneteenth in June, and part of it was like, what do people know? What do they not know? Right? And a lot of it is like, okay, well, we know about it. We know it exists, but like, what was it? Okay, so let's actually talk about it, right? So now people are more informed so that then we can facilitate and start kind of moving the needle, right? And I think if you don't start with the information, then it can just become he said, she said, they said, we said, right? And that the combative interaction isn't actually going to help anything.
Awareness to education, to repetition, to habit is how that has to go. And that really does start, it should start from the top down or in some organizations, it's brought up from, underneath to upper layers. But I think what's great, Siobhan, is you're very proactive about including people in the conversation. It's less a lecture. It should be a conversation. It should be a safe space for people to say, I didn't even realize that I had these unconscious biases of, seeing someone walk towards me on the street. The other thing I want to bring up for anyone that is watching, and I am blanking on the creator of this, but it's called a diversity wheel. So when you think diversity, you're thinking age, race, ethnicity, gender. There are so many layers to diversity. Personality, it falls into that category. Status, household income. There's so many factors at play when it comes to quote unquote diversity. And so the more that you are educated about the layers of diversity allows you to implement better practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have more productive conversations with your team members.
No, Rachel, I completely agree, right? The Loudest Duck is a book that my team has read, and it really focuses more on understanding in any group, there's a dominant and non-dominant group, right? In a group of women, there's a dominant entity, right? In a group of engineers, the dominance is likely they're college educated with engineering degrees, right? So if somebody doesn't fit that mold, then that person might still be a white male, but that doesn't mean they're not the diversity in that group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's huge when it comes to talking about DEI. It's that diversity of experience. I joined my team after 10 plus years, as I said, at another organization. So I ask a lot of questions when I'm here because I see things differently, right? And I've had a lot of conversations with my senior leaders about why we do things a certain way. Like, what are we trying to achieve with this, right? And they're developed enough in their leadership journey that to say, oh, well, tell me more about why you are asking this question. Like, what are you seeing that I'm not seeing, right? And it'd be really easy for them to say, well, because this is the way we do it.
Right.
And that's not creating that collaboration, and it's like really creating a culture where that diversity of experience and thought is appreciated.
I could not agree more. And I think the work you're doing is amazing, not only in what your company does, which is very incredible and niche and impressive, but the work that you are leading as the GM, the leader, the mama bear of all the amazing people lucky enough to work with you at Walbar. So Siobhan, I can't thank you enough for coming on and for some really important conversations with me and letting us banter for a bit.
This is awesome, Rachel. Thanks so much for having us. Me, even not just us.
all of you, all of your personalities, your beings, and whoever you are today. For everyone watching, thank you so much for tuning into The Mill. We will see you next time.